The road stretched on, and the dust swirled thickly as Leonor Galvan clutched the wire cage tighter. Inside, 3 hens watched the world with that patience only animals understand. She carried a cracked leather suitcase in her other hand, and on either side, a small child clung to her skirt. The older one was 8 years old, and his name was Nicanor, and the younger one was barely 4, and they called him Chavita, because Salvador was too long a name for such a small mouth. The afternoon was slowly settling over the valley, painting the adobe fences and the dry hilltops orange. In the background, between an abandoned plot of land and a path overgrown with tall grass, stood the flour mill, a tile roof sagging at one corner, a weathered wooden door, walls stained by decades of rain and neglect. Inside, Leonor knew, there was a broken millstone, an adobe oven that no one had lit in years, and a silence that smelled of old flour and animals that were no longer there. She was 28 years old, abandoned by the man who had sworn to stay, rejected by the family that was supposed to support her, with 2 children clinging to her and 3 hens clucking softly inside their cage. And unaware that this dilapidated mill nestled among the hills held, within its cracked walls, a secret that had been waiting for her for 40 years. If you've ever felt like the world turned its back on you when you needed a helping hand the most, stick around until the end of this story, because what this woman did with 3 chickens and a crumbling house will keep you thinking all night long. Welcome, and please share which part of Mexico or which corner of the world you're listening from today. Like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single story. Let the story begin. In the villages of yesteryear, in times still measured by the seasons rather than by clocks, stories like this were told by the warmth of the hearth, over cups of coffee served slowly and along dirt roads that no one marked on any map. They were told so that no one would forget that life, no matter how much it tries to knock us down, always leaves a door ajar for those brave enough to push it open. Leonor was born in a small village called San Joaquin del Monte, the only child of Celestina Galvan, a woman with slender hands and a soft voice, who left early when the girl was barely 10 years old. She died of lung disease, from that persistent cough that, in those days, could not be cured without a doctor or a real remedy. Leonor was raised by her grandmother Ubaldina, a woman dry on the outside and warm on the inside, one of those who doesn't say, "I love you," but puts it in every plate of beans, in every loaf of bread, in every patch on a dress. Grandmother Ubaldina knew the stove as others know their prayers. She had a way of kneading bread that the whole town recognized, and she also had a notebook where she jotted things down, things Leonor never saw open. Because Grandma kept it in a chest under the bed and said it was for times that hadn't come yet. Grandma Ubaldina died when Leonor was 16, and the little house in town went to an aunt who never had patience for quiet girls. So Leonor soon learned to fend for herself, as girls who have no one to look out for them do. She cooked, sewed, and did laundry for others when needed. At 18, she met Fulgencio Arambula at a patron saint's festival. He was tall, with light eyes, a rancher from the vast lands, with that smile that makes you fall in love and hides things at the same time. They married quickly, more out of a hunger for a hug than out of a considered love. Nicanor was born, Chavita was born, and Fulgencio began to disappear for weeks on end, chasing cattle that always had to be driven farther away. One day, he didn't come back. The news arrived from a passing mule driver. He said he'd seen him in Tepalchingo with another woman, holding a baby just a few months old. Leonor didn't cry in front of anyone. She did what she had always learned to do. She kept kneading dough, kept boiling broth, kept raising her children. But her family, who had barely remembered her before, showed up then to tell her that an abandoned woman was a disgrace, that her children would grow up scarred, that she'd better hand them over to someone else and go work as a servant in someone else's home. The aunt who had raised her was the harshest. She told her that she must have seen something in the man that made him leave, that things like that don't happen by chance. Leonore swallowed her words, as always. But inside her, something hardened. Something that had been growing in silence for years and had finally found ground to take root. She took from around her neck the gold chain that had belonged to her grandmother Ubaldina, the only valuable object she owned, and sold it to the pawnbroker in the neighboring village. With that money, plus the little she had saved by sewing at night by the light of the oil lamp, she bought the deed to a forgotten property that no one wanted. A ruined flour mill, a 2-day walk away, in a valley between hills, in a village called Las Animas del Socorro. The notary told her she was crazy, that the building had been closed for 40 years, that not even animals wanted to go near it. She signed without hesitation and gathered her children. She left at dawn, without saying goodbye to anyone, because saying goodbye was a luxury she could no longer afford. She packed the dark dress that had belonged to her grandmother, a prayer card of the Virgin of Talpa, 2 changes of clothes for the children, a few items of clothing for herself, and, in a jute bag with slits for air, she trapped the 3 hens that had survived the neglect of the past year. She called them Panchita, Canela, and Pinta. They were all she had of her own, besides her children's bodies and her firm resolve not to return. The truck that took her part of the way dropped her off at the crossroads. From there, she had to walk 3 hours with the children and the chickens, under a sun that seemed intent on testing her before letting her arrive. When she finally rounded the last bend and saw the flour mill silhouetted against the hill, Leonore paused for a long moment and took a deep breath. The building was larger than she had imagined and at the same time more dilapidated. The roof, caved in on one side, revealed the bare beams like the ribs of an old animal. The front door hung by a single hinge. The north wall had a crack that zigzagged up to the cornice. But it was hers. Every stone, every adobe brick, every blade of grass growing from the dirt floor was hers, signed for and paid for. She pushed the door open, and the smell greeted her as time greets those who have waited for it. Dust from old flour clinging to the beams, weathered wood, cobwebs in the corners, a still air that had gone undisturbed for decades. In the center, larger than she had expected, was the millstone, split into 2 pieces, but with the stone base still firm. In the back, the adobe oven, its mouth black and empty like a small cave, a long wooden table with a broken leg leaning against the wall, a wooden chest in a corner, locked with an iron padlock that the damp had corroded. Nicanor looked at her and asked quietly if they were going to live there. Leonore knelt down, took the boy's hands, and simply said yes, that this was their home now, and that the 3 of them were going to make it beautiful. Chavita didn't even ask. She let the chickens loose on the dirt floor, sat down, and began chasing them, laughing with that unclouded laugh that only very young children have. That laugh that, for a second, gave Leonore back the reason for everything. That first night, the 3 of them slept embraced on 2 blankets spread out in a corner where the ceiling still held. Leonore lit a candle and stared at the beams for a long time, listening to her children's quiet breathing and the little footsteps of the chickens that had already settled in a corner. Outside, the wind rustled the dry branches of a mesquite tree, and a distant dove called to another that did not answer. Inside her, my people, something like a root was beginning to take shape. It wasn't a house yet. It wasn't land yet. It wasn't a home yet. But it was the beginning of something that could become all of that. At dawn on the second day, Leonore went out to the lot and began what had to be begun. She cut the weeds covering the ground around the house with an old knife. She swept away the dust accumulated over 40 years with a broom made of dry branches. She removed the remains of nests and the corn husks that had been left in the corners. Her hands grew rough before noon, but she kept going. The pain was the good kind, the kind that signals the body is turning neglect into something new. The children helped as best they could, carrying small stones, fetching water from the stream that ran further down, feeding the chickens with corn kernels that Leonore had saved for the journey. It was on the third day, as she was trying to lift the rusty lid of the adobe oven with a thick stick, that she heard footsteps on the path. She looked up and saw a woman of indeterminate age, with a brown shawl crossed over her chest and a basket on her arm, walking unhurriedly toward the house. Her white hair was pulled back into a tight bun, her skin weathered by many suns, and her light eyes showed no surprise at finding someone living in that place. "Good afternoon, my dear," said the woman when she was close. "My name is Remigia. I live up there, up the hill, behind the big huizache tree. I saw smoke coming out last night and thought someone had finally come to wake this mill." She didn't ask Leonore's name. She didn't ask where she came from or why she was bringing 2 children alone. She simply opened the basket and took out a clay pot still warm with corn atole, a piece of fresh cheese wrapped in a corn husk, and 4 handmade tortillas, the kind that still steam when you unfold the napkin. She set them on the cracked wooden table and sat down on the little stool as if she had arrived at the place where she belonged. Leonore thanked her in the soft voice of someone unaccustomed to receiving. The children approached curiously, first with the shyness of small animals, and then with the hunger of any child who smells good food. Chavita clung to the old woman's skirt with that animal instinct children have when they recognize someone without guile. Doña Remigia stroked her head, as if she'd known her forever. "This mill has a history," said the old woman in a calm voice, looking at the cracked millstone in the center of the house. "I knew it when it was still the bread house for the whole valley." "That was a long time ago, my dear. But the stone still works. It can be fixed. The walls, too. What was built with love doesn't fall apart in a single blow." Leonore remained silent, watching her. There was something about Doña Remigia that made her feel as if she had arrived at a place that, in some way, was already waiting for her. The old woman ate slowly, spoke little, and before leaving told her that the next day she would return with some eggs and a man who could help her fix the roof. His name was Don Pastor Mendivil. "He doesn't charge for helping," Doña Remigia said with a half-smile. "He charges for the bread when there is any, and that day will come." That very afternoon, while trying to clean the old chest in the corner, Leonore finally managed to pry open the rusty padlock with a piece of iron. She lifted the lid with trembling hands, not out of fear, but because of that strange sensation one feels when opening things that have been closed for a long time. Inside were moth-eaten fabrics, an empty burlap sack, and, at the very bottom, wrapped in a carefully folded cloth, a notebook. She took it out slowly. It was a notebook with thick, hand-stitched pages and a leather cover already cracked at the edges. She opened it and felt her heart skip a beat inside her chest. The first page bore a date from 40 years ago, and a name written in firm, even handwriting, that rounded script taught in village schools at the turn of the century. The name read Ubaldina Flores de Galvan. Leonor had to sit down. Ubaldina Flores, her grandmother. The grandmother who had raised her. The grandmother whose secret notebook had been under the bed in a box she had never opened. But that notebook wasn't that one. It was another, an older one she didn't know. She turned the pages carefully, like someone running a hand through a sleeping child's hair. They were recipes. Recipes for bread, for atole, for panocha, for flour empanadas. Precise instructions. Amounts of flour, kneading time, oven temperature. And among the recipes, notes in the margins, random phrases written down when a thought demanded to be released. Bread turns out better when the dough rests all night. Mesquite wood gives it flavor. Oak wood gives it fire. Never knead in a hurry, because haste shows in the bread. At the end of the notebook, on a page already yellowed, there was a short dedication, written in that same firm handwriting. For whoever comes after me and finds this mill empty, may the dough be generous with your hands. Leonor closed the notebook slowly. She didn't cry, but it took her a long time to move again. In her head, her grandmother's voice echoed, saying what she never finished explaining, what always hung in the air like a promise with no recipient. For times that have not yet come, times like this very day. She still didn't understand how a notebook from her grandmother had ended up in a house she'd bought by chance, in a town she'd never been to. But something inside her told her that Doña Remigia knew, and it also told her she had to wait. Great truths, Leonor thought, aren't torn away by force. They fall like ripe fruit when the time is right. The following days were filled with non-stop work. Don Pastor Mendivil arrived as Doña Remigia had promised, with an old cart and some fired roof tiles left over from another job. He was a gaunt old man with enormous hands and a palm leaf hat that had lost its original color many years ago. He spoke little and worked hard. In 3 days they fixed the roof so it wouldn't leak. In another 5, they installed the door, sealed the crack in the north wall with a mixture of lime and sand, and even managed to build a sort of chicken coop behind the house, using dry reeds and wire, salvaged from a fallen fence. The 3 hens, Panchita, Canela, and Pinta, settled in there with that dignity that birds seem to acquire when they feel the house is theirs and that no one is going to chase them away. Doña Remigia came by almost every day. She brought eggs when she had extra. She brought coffee when Leonor's ran out. She brought words when there was a need to talk. And she brought silence when there was a need to be quiet. She taught Leonor which herbs in the garden were good for tea and which ones needed to be cut because they were draining the soil. She showed her where the well was, further up the hill, and how to draw water without hurting her back. She told her which neighbors were good and which ones to watch carefully when they approached to offer things that hadn't been asked for. One of those people to be watched carefully arrived at dusk the following Saturday. He rode a fine-stepped gray horse, dressed in a starched white shirt and an expensive felt hat, the kind you don't see on the ranch, but only in the big town. His name was Don Nemesio Balboa, and he owned the vast lands surrounding Las Animas del Socorro. He stopped the horse 3 paces from the entrance, but did not dismount. Men who do not dismount, Leonor had learned, never come to ask. They always come to demand. "Good afternoon, ma'am," he said in that voice powerful men use when feigning courtesy. "I was told you bought this mill. I came to introduce myself and also to make a proposal that would be advantageous to both parties." Leonor wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out into the courtyard. She looked at him without lowering her gaze. Don Nemesio smiled like someone who already knows what he's going to say before he even starts. "This mill is finished, ma'am. You're a woman on your own, with young children, without a husband to support you. There's no way this can succeed. I'm offering you double what you paid, in cash, today. You take your children to a bigger town, find a decent little house, and start a new life more in line with your means. This land is right next to my ranch. It's more practical this way, believe me, for everyone." Leonor listened until the end, just as she had learned to always listen to men in power, quietly and with dignity. Then she replied, her voice calm and firm as the stone of the oven. "Thank you for coming, Don Nemesio. But this mill is not for sale. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. I came to stay, and here I stay." The man narrowed his eyes. His smile faded a little, but not entirely. "Think it over carefully, ma'am," he said, lowering his voice. "Things in the countryside get difficult sometimes. A bolt of lightning in a storm, a fire, an animal that falls ill, a child who gets lost in the woods. You'll understand that a woman on her own has more to look after than a man." "I understand perfectly what you're saying, Don Nemesio," Leonor replied, "and I also understand what you're not saying. But my answer is the same, and it won't change." Don Nemesio touched the brim of his hat with 2 fingers, turned his horse, and rode off at a trot. He didn't look back. Leonor stood in the courtyard until the dust from the road settled back onto the ground. Nicanor had heard everything from the doorway, his eyes wide. His mother bent down, ran her hand through his hair, and told him slowly, as one teaches important things, that this was his home, and that what belongs to you, you take care of without asking anyone's permission. 2 weeks later, when the first loaf of bread had already been baked in the old, half-restored adobe oven, and the scent had traveled through the entire valley, up to the hills, the other threat arrived. He arrived on foot, dusty, with that mixture of false regret and genuine demand that men bring when they discover the woman they abandoned has begun to thrive without them. Fulgencio Arambula appeared one Friday afternoon, standing in the doorway of the new gate as if he had never left, as if the 2 years of silence were merely a misunderstanding that could be resolved with a smile. "Leonor," he said, in that voice she had heard 1,000 times against her pillow a lifetime ago. "I've come to get you." The children ran out upon hearing their father's voice. Nicanor stopped dead in the middle of the yard, unsure whether to approach or retreat, a look of uncertainty on his face that broke Leonor's heart in a place where she thought there was nothing left to break. Chavita, who barely remembered him, hid behind her mother's legs. Leonor didn't move. She looked at Fulgencio for a long time, the way one looks at something that was once important and is now just a memory in the shape of a man. "Come to look for what, Fulgencio?" "My family, you, the children. I made mistakes. I know. I admit them. But I came to fix things. I'll help you with this thing you have here. Between the 2 of us, we can get the mill up in half the time. I'm good with wood. You know I'm good with wood." Leonor laughed softly. It was a joyless laugh, the kind that comes out when you understand just how far human audacity can go. "You? Help me? Now that the mill has a new roof and an oven that's already baking? Now that someone in town told you I bought property? Where were you when Chavita had a fever of 40 degrees, and I thought she was slipping away in my arms? Where were you when Nicanor asked for you every night before bed, and I made up stories so he wouldn't cry?" Fulgencio lowered his gaze for a moment, but raised it with that hardness she'd known all her life. "Leonore, don't complicate things. The children are mine too. I have rights under the law. If you don't let me stay here as I should, I'm taking Nicanor with me. He's old enough to work now. He's a boy. He belongs to me." And you know that the law, in these cases, gives the father the final say. That, my friends, was when something inside Leonore that had been dormant for years fully awoke. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She walked toward the entrance of the house, took the thick piece of mesquite firewood from the wall that she used to barricade the door at night, and dropped it onto the floor of the hallway with a sharp thud that echoed throughout the valley like a warning. "Fulgencio," she said in a low but clear voice, "you left 2 years ago. You left behind a woman pregnant with anguish and 2 children who asked for you every night. You started a family with someone else. You didn't come back even when the youngest had a fever, or when the oldest was stung by a scorpion in the yard. Now you're leaving this property. You're leaving today. You're not coming back tomorrow. And if you even try to lay a finger on a single one of my children, I swear by the memory of my grandmother Ubaldina, who is buried beneath the earth of San Joaquin del Monte, that you won't find a single door in this valley that will open for you, nor a single hand that will give you a piece of bread." Fulgencio wanted to say something, but he couldn't find his voice anywhere. Around the road, 2 neighbors had appeared who had heard loud voices, and further back came Don Pastor Mendivil, walking with a machete at his belt, and his eyes narrowed. Fulgencio looked around, understood what the old man's eyes were telling him without the need for words, clenched his teeth, and turned on his heel. Before crossing the gate, he turned one last time and said, with venom that came out wrong, that this wouldn't stand, that rights are rights, and that he would be back with papers. And he left. And the dust from the road, which had been kicked up by his arrival, settled again with his departure, as if the earth itself were erasing him. Doña Remigia arrived that very night, because she had heard, as one hears everything in villages where news travels faster than carts. She sat on the little bench in the hallway, next to Leonore, who had already put the children to bed, and was gazing at the starry sky without tears, but with that exhaustion that comes from having fought too hard for too long. The old woman placed a hand on her knee and stayed that way for quite a while, saying nothing, because there are silences that weigh more than words when shared by someone who knows. "My dear," Doña Remigia said at last, "there are things I have to tell you. I kept them to myself because I thought you should arrive at this place on your own, without anyone telling you beforehand. And you did. Now it's time to tell you." Leonore looked at her, not understanding. "I met your grandmother Ubaldina when we were both girls," the old woman began, and her voice grew soft, like the voice of an ancient memory. "We were born in this very valley, half a league apart. We used to go together to the stream to wash rags. We learned to pray the rosary on the same bench in the old church of Las Animas. Your grandmother had the most beautiful hands for making bread that I have ever known in my entire life. This mill, the one you bought, belonged to my family back then, to my father. And when your grandmother turned 15, she came to work here as a baker. For 5 years, until she met your grandfather, who had come from San Joaquin del Monte looking for good flour for a wedding. This mill was her home as well. This notebook you found in the chest was written by her own hand. She left it here the day she left, saying that someday someone who came here hungry for a place of their own would need it. That's what she said. I saw her put it away myself." Leonore felt the air slowly leaving her chest, like the air leaving a balloon without a sound. The tears she had held back with Fulgencio now fell silently, one after another, rolling down her cheeks until they disappeared into her apron. When I was left alone, Doña Remigia continued, after my only son died of a fever at 22, and my husband followed him a few months later, the mill began to fall apart on its own. I had neither the strength nor the will, but I always knew that one day someone would come. And 3 months ago, when a friend of the notary told me that someone was buying the deed, I went myself to the county seat and asked for the name. They told me Leonor Galvan. Galvan, like your grandmother. And I understood that life, my girl, life has its quiet ways of closing the circles that seem to have remained open forever. Doña Remigia pulled a piece of paper folded in 4 from her apron pocket. It was old, yellowed at the edges, but the ink was still legible. Your grandmother signed this when she left here. My father kept it in a box. My son kept it in a chest. I've kept it in my trunk for 30 years. It says that any of her bloodline who came to this mill had a preferential right to the 8 hectares in the valley below, the ones Don Nemesio is trying to buy. They're lands with water, with their own stream. It's yours if you claim it with this paper at the notary's office. Leonor looked at the paper, looked at her grandmother's signature with that rounded handwriting she had learned to recognize in the notebook, then looked at the old woman, then looked at the dark door of the house where her children slept. Something inside her, my people, something that had been nothing but survival for years, became hope again for the first time. And hope, when it returns after a long absence, is almost harder to hold on to than grief. Years passed, because life goes on, even though it sometimes seems to stand still. Leonor claimed the 8 hectares with the papers signed by her grandmother, and the notary in the county seat had no way to deny her the right. Don Nemesio made a scene 2 or 3 times, sent a lawyer from the city in a suit, and with a loud voice sent veiled threats through third parties. But a document is a document. The law is the law. And the town, that town which at first had looked at Leonor with the suspicious eye of those who distrust women on their own, began to regard her with a newfound respect when they smelled the bread coming out of the mill's oven every morning, and when they realized that this slender woman in a dark dress had deeper roots in the valley than many of those born there. Fulgencio never returned. Someone said months later that he had been seen in a bar in Zamora, thinner, older, lonelier. The woman he had left for had left him too, with the same ease with which he had left Leonor. Someone said later that he had been seen looking for work as a cowboy on foreign lands. Leonor didn't ask. She had learned that certain things are let go without turning one's face away, because turning one's face away is to give them strength they don't deserve. Nicanor grew up strong. He learned the ways of the countryside from Doña Remigia and Don Pastor, and by the age of 15 he was already running the mill alongside his mother. Chavita showed a knack for numbers and letters, and the priest from the neighboring village, Father Anselmo, who came once a month to say Mass, offered to teach him to read and write properly, as long as he kept studying. The 3 hens from the beginning, Panchita, Canela, and Pinta, multiplied until the coop had to be expanded 3 times over. From 3, they grew to 30. From 30 to 100. From eggs, they grew to chicks. From chicks to orders from the entire town. But what made Leonor Galvan famous throughout that valley, what people still talk about when they pass through Las Animas del Socorro to draw water from the well, was the bread. Following the recipes in her grandmother Ubaldina's notebook, Leonore made the best wheat bread the valley had tasted in 40 years. Anise bread, semita with piloncillo, flour empanadas stuffed with sweet pumpkin, pan de muerto for November with toasted sesame seeds on top. People came from 3 towns away with empty carts and returned with full ones. On holidays, the mill's oven didn't stop running from 3 in the morning. And since life is shaped like a circle, my friends, like a wheel that turns and returns to the same point, with different faces, one April afternoon, many years later, a young woman arrived at the mill with 2 little girls holding her hand, a small cardboard suitcase, and eyes sunken from having walked a long way without really knowing where she was going. Leonore saw her from the hallway, wiping flour from her hands on her apron, and recognized her before the woman even opened her mouth. She recognized herself from 15 years ago, standing just the same on the road, with the same fear in her back and the same dignity in her chest. She walked toward her slowly, without haste, and told her only to come in, that there was warm coffee on the stove, that the girls must be hungry. They say in Las Animas del Socorro that at the Galvan mill the door has never been closed to any woman who arrives with children and in fear. They say that Doña Remigia died peacefully in Leonore's house at the age of 93, with her shawl on and Nicanor's hand holding hers until her last breath. They say that Don Nemesio Balboa lost half his cattle in a fierce frost during a harsh winter and never fully recovered, and that in the end he ended up selling Leonore, at the very same price he had wanted to pay her years earlier, a strip of land the mill needed for the cart path. They say that when they asked Leonore, now an old woman, with hair as white as Doña Remigia's and hands as rough as Don Pastor's, how she had managed to get by with so little, she always answered the same way, with that quiet smile that had grown slowly over the years. "I didn't get by with little," she would say. "I got by with enough. And enough, when you know how to use it, is almost everything." There are people who look at a dilapidated house and see only broken bricks. There are people who look at the same place and see an opportunity waiting for hands that aren't afraid to get dirty. Leonore Galvan had no money, no husband, no family to support her. She had nothing but 2 children, 3 chickens, an old notebook, and the firm resolve not to give up. It was enough to change her life and that of many other women who, over time, found at her doorstep what she hadn't found at hers when she needed it most. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson, my friends, the one worth taking away as this story ends. That sometimes the place we arrive at, driven by necessity, turns out to be exactly the place we belong to before we even knew it. God has those quiet ways of setting things right, of tying together the loose threads of generations that never got to know one another. Grandmother Ubaldina had kneaded bread in that mill 40 years earlier, never imagining that her granddaughter would arrive there with a broken heart and empty hands to find the recipes and papers that would sustain her. The earth responds, my friends, when we never tire of asking it. And the past, when we treat it with respect, sometimes sustains us more strongly than the present. If this story touched something inside you, if you ever felt that the world had turned its back on you, and yet you still got back up with what you had left, leave me a like right now. Subscribe to this channel, turn on the notification bell so you don't miss a single story, and tell me in the comments which moment in this story tugged at your heart the most. Share it with someone who needs to hear today that starting over isn't a weakness, that it is, on the contrary, the bravest act a human being can perform with what remains of their life. Until the next story, stay with God, and may He bless your home just as he blessed Leonor Galvan's flour mill in Las Animas del Socorro, where, according to those who pass by, the scent of freshly baked bread still lingers when the sun rises over the valley.